Welcome to Nice Ashes. I'm Mike.
And I'm Nate. What are we smoking, Mike?
We are going to smoke one of my favorites, the Cao Mx2.
Which you've never smoked before, if I'm not mistaken.
I've had these cigars many times. I like it.
Yes, I know. All right, let's light them up.
Mm-hmm.
I will tell you, now that we're in season 2, I've been a lot more diligent on making sure that my initial light is very even and, fully burning. And it's made for a lot nicer smoke throughout and a lot less relights on my part. Of course, being indoors helps now, but I think getting that initial light is super important.
It is. And my lighting technique has changed over the years to where I take a couple puffs and then I take the lighter and I kind of circle it and get it nice and hot.
Yep. I light it, take some puffs, make sure everything's lit, take some puffs, and then look again at the end to make sure that there's no dark spots that haven't stayed lit, and then just kind of torch those. So this one is nice. The first couple puffs, it seems, I don't know if smoother is the right term, because our last stick was very, very smooth. Maybe a little, and buttery isn't really not in the sense of flavor, but it's smooth.
It's smooth. It's got a dark note.
Yeah.
But not overpowering. Very nice cigar. I don't know. I think these are out of a box I bought a couple years ago. Because I bought a box at a cigar shop. So I have the physical MX2 box. Because I really like them. I wanted to have a good base of cigars. And
so in terms of topic today, what are we doing?
Mm-hmm. We're going to talk about Dune, the books.
But the books, yes.
Yep.
Okay, and so we both recently finished reading all 8 books in the main timeline. Mm-hmm. And you did it for the 3rd time, right?
This is my 2nd time through.
Okay.
Yep. This is only my 2nd.
And this is my first time through all of them, and I have all my ratings up because I use Goodreads every time I read something so I can keep track of what I read and if I liked it or not. And Goodreads does a 5-star rating system. Sometimes sites do 10 stars or 5 stars or whatever. So I'm going to say this up front, and then I'm sure you're going to kind of lead the conversation for most of it because you've read it before, and we've kind of talked off the podcast about some of the Dune stuff, but never in depth about the books per se. So I rated every single Dune book, all 8 of them, either a 4 out of 5 or a 5 out of 5. And
really?
the ones that I liked least, meaning the 4 out of 5s, which are still great books. So the first Dune was a 5 out of 5 for me. Dune Messiah, which is the second one, was a 4 out of 5 for me. That one's quite a bit shorter, if I remember correctly. Children of Dune was a 5 out of 5. God Emperor of Dune was a 5 out of 5. And I feel like God Emperor of Dune was my favorite book of the entire series. And Heretics of Dune was a 4 out of 5. Chapter House was a 4 out of 5. Hunters of Dune was a 4 out of 5. And the last one I gave a 5 out of 5. Sandworms of Dune. And just for full disclosure, Hunters of Dune and Sandworms of Dune were written by Brian Herbert, Frank's son, and Kevin J. Anderson. So they co-wrote both of those based on outlines and things they found in a safety deposit box after their father had died, or his father had died.
Yes, that is the case. And I have read most of the extended Dune universe as well.
Yes.
Did
you have somewhere you wanted to start, or?
Yeah, I was going to start because we just read the main timeline, and there are a bunch of Dune novels outside of the main timeline.
All by Brian and Kevin, I think.
Yeah, all by Brian and Kevin. And I like them all. I think they're good. Not that everybody else is going to think the same thing, obviously.
Yeah, and I remember when I bought the first one at the bookstore, they were like, oh, this one's great, but ignore all the rest. And I'm so glad that I didn't listen to that.
Right. I was going to say that the first Dune is a classic, and if you read the first one, you're going to want to read the second. The first 3, which is Dune, Dune Messiah, and Children of Dune, that really could be a trilogy in and of itself.
Yeah.
And there's no real reason to go past that unless you want to read a lot of Dune.
I think the divisive book in the series is God Emperor of Dune, because my brother got to that book and then he gave up the entire series because he thought it was stupid. And it turns out that God Emperor was my favorite one. of the series, I think. So
Really?
I think that one's divisive. I don't know that it has to be your favorite, but I think if you enjoy that one, then you might as well read the rest of them, at least in the main timeline.
Right. Yeah. If you can make it through, quote unquote, if you can make it through God Emperor of Dune, you might as well read the rest of it.
So it sounds like you're pretty amazed that God Emperor of Dune was my favorite. So
well,
why don't we? Should we start there?
We can start there. Yeah. So God Emperor of Dune is a transition book between the original storyline and then the beginning of the extended
everything
Dune
else
universe.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's weird for sure.
Oh man, it's so weird, and it spans like 1,500 years.
Yes. Well, it's 5,000 years ahead or 3,000 years ahead of Children of Dune. So all the people that you were invested in for the first three are all dead, including
not all of them.
The original Leto is pretty much no longer there, right? Like so,
he was there.
Sure, he's a totally different character, and all of the other, I don't know how many names we should drop just in case people want to read Dune, because it's a spoiler to say the one guy's name for sure.
Oh, but these books have been out for a long time, so I think let's give our listeners our last chance right now, and let's just say that we can't properly talk about the 8 Dune books in the main Dune timeline without spoilers. So if you haven't read them and you want to read them and be surprised, then just stop listening right now and come back and listen after you've read the 8, or listen to them on an audiobook or whatever you want to do. Because I don't think we can. We won't. It'd be a 10-minute episode if we can't talk about what happens in the Dune books.
Right, and that revolves around certain characters for sure. And the most important character in the Dune universe is not Paul Atreides,
or even Leto too,
or even Leto. No. So, all right, last chance.
Last chance.
All right, so
here we go.
One of the most interesting parts about the God Emperor is that the only character you really know is Duncan Idaho, because it's the original Duncan Idaho, just moved in time.
Well,
and
Gola.
Then Leto is totally as a Gola, and he's totally different. Leto is totally different, and the whole universe is totally different. And it's kind of the first time I read it, I didn't quite understand why people were so angry at Leto from the description of what was going on. Yeah, it didn't seem like that bad of a place, really.
Well, basically, he made them not fight.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's like a gross oversummation, but that was his whole plan, was to give them so many thousands of years of peace as contrast to everything else. Because think of the upheaval in the first 3 Dune books with, Paul overthrowing the Emperor Shaddam and instilling his own jihad and emperorship, and, him going off to be the prophet. And then his kids and Leia, I don't know how you pronounce it.
Aaliyah. The only reason why I know is because I listened to the audiobooks.
Oh, yeah. I really enjoyed...
Kwisatz Haderach.
Yep. Which is not how I pronounce it. I pronounce it with a lot harder H sound, much like I did with our guest last episode.
Yes.
And I'm bad at pronouncing things. There I go again with my incredible mastery of the English language. I pronounced it wrong. I think Leto 2 is my favorite character in the entire series.
He is. I wouldn't say he's mine. I think, and this comes in later, I think Miles Tegg is probably my favorite.
He's great. He is great.
Yeah, because he's kind of like the culmination of the breeding program without being a Kwisatz Haderach,
Yep. Although they hinted in the last book that he may well have been.
Mm-hmm.
After the T probe. But at first, so I want to get this out of the way. At first, I was very annoyed about Duncan Idaho being everywhere all the time. And they kept bringing him back through the Gola program. And I was like, okay, we're thousands of years beyond. Like, let's please just move on. But as a literary device, I came to enjoy him because he was kind of me, the reader. Right? Because he had been there in the original book, and he had been there through the Gola program and everything else. So he was kind of like the anchor point for the reader. And of course, there's huge plot points later on involving Duncan, but for the reader, he was kind of an anchor point, and they kept bringing him back and bringing him back. And at first it was annoying, but once I kind of understood that he was kind of a guide for me, the reader, to wrap my head around the stuff that was happening, because everything was moving so fast because the leaps in time were massive for a while there. But I think Leto 2 was one of my favorite characters because of the things that he did. And they really, in the last book, Sandworms of Dune, I really wanted them to harken back to this, but Leto 2 basically invented or bred or made, because he had his own breeding program running counter to the Bene Gesserit breeding program, and he basically made Duncan to be unseeable by the prescient visions, which led to the no ships and led to all of that stuff, the things that couldn't be seen.
Right. It wasn't just Duncan. It was the Atreides line as well.
Well, yeah, and that was the most fascinating thing, is not only did Leto 2 take the huge sacrifice that Paul wouldn't or couldn't, but he took it, and the merging with the sand trout and becoming a giant, and the book cover is one of my favorites because it's like this giant like penis worm with a little face sticking out the top. And Sarah's like, "What in the fuck are you reading right now?" And I'm like, "Oh man, it's great." And she's like, "Okay, whatever." But I mean, it's a huge leap, right? Like he's merging with a different species and becoming something completely different. But he laid the groundwork for all of this no ship stuff and all of these things, and that never would have happened had he not done what he did. And some of the scenes between him and, I can't remember now who he wanted his wife to be and who ultimately his wife was, but only in like namesake. But I think her and one of the Duncan Golas like got it on. Do you remember? I can't remember what her name was.
It doesn't really matter.
Yeah, I mean, she was only pertinent for that one book, The God Emperor of Dune, but
she was only pertinent for a small portion of that book. She was kind of like a trigger device,
Yeah, and I feel like, and she was kind of designed to be a trigger device, and he knew that, and he still wanted her, So I feel like it was one of those tales. I mean, almost like Romeo and Juliet or something, where you've got the love, but you can't be with them for some reason. And I don't know. I feel like his character was far more complex, or far more complexly written than Paul Atreides. Like in the first Dune book, you don't really get to know Paul a whole lot because he's almost kind of like bustled along for most of it and just reacting to things as things happen,
Right. He's a tool. He was a tool that was created, and he was created for the purpose that he was created as a tool for that situation by the breeding program.
Yeah. And you didn't really get to know him as a person as far as like, a book goes. So I guess I felt a lot more connection with Leto 2 because, you get him growing up with his sister and trying to, with the whole wolf thing, or I don't know if they were really wolves, but they bred these
Lays
like tigers or wolves. Oh, tigers. Yeah.
Yeah.
To assassinate them. And so they had this whole thing, and they were kind of sort of abominations from the get-go, right? Like they kind of had full prescience at the beginning. But you kind of got to know that, and the trade-offs that he had to take and the choices that he made or chose to make for the betterment of everything. And, everybody called him a tyrant, the tyrant Leto 2. And I don't know that was truly accurate. I can see how people would think that, but I don't know. I feel like the character is really well written, and the circumstances around him were really well written. And maybe it was more because it was the closest thing to a character study, kind of.
Well, he was even more fleshed out in some ways than Duncan Idaho, who was pretty much the main character of Dune. By accident, just so you know. Duncan Idaho was not supposed to be the main character of the Dune universe, but he was very popular. And Frank Herbert got a lot of fan mail saying that they wanted him to bring him back for the second book.
Okay, yeah.
And that's how it happened. So, very interesting. I suppose we should we lay down a groundwork for the Dune universe, or
I mean, let's do it. Let's do it. I mean, so if you've read the Dune books, or if you haven't and you're not planning to, but you want to follow along with our podcast today, let's lay down the groundwork, and then we can kind of build off of there. I didn't really want to jump the gun by saying like Leto 2 was my favorite and God Emperor of Dune was probably my favorite book of the whole series. And I know that's kind of a very divisive statement to make because a lot of people get turned off by God Emperor of Dune and they don't want anything else to do with the universe. So let's lay down the groundwork, Mike, and
Right.
then we'll
A
go
lot of
from
people
there.
are going to be watching the movies. I have never seen the television show or the old movie. I only watched the new movie.
Yep, I will tell
I
you
should.
the television series is great. I'd have to watch it again, but that was my first exposure to Dune was that miniseries,
Okay, I have them at the house.
and I
I just
really
haven't
enjoyed
watched
it.
them. Oh, good.
The one with Sting, I tried to watch it 3 or 4 times because I tried to watch the theatrical one and I turned it off after 15 minutes because it was like the worst stuff I've ever seen. And I've seen, and you know, Mike, I've seen some stuff. And then I tried to watch the director's cut, and that was just as bad. And then I tried to watch like a fan edit where they tried to like make it match the book more, and it was still terrible, and I didn't know what the hell was going on. So I just can't watch that movie, I guess.
Interesting. I want to watch it, but I haven't yet.
Well, maybe we should
So-
watch it together.
We should. We could watch it and maybe we could do a live critical review.
I'm down.
Oh, I'd totally be down. So something that we can do in the future. So
Indeed.
Dune universe. It's 10,000 years ahead of present time. Earth is not even remembered by the majority of the population. It's an intergalactic society that has reverted to a feudal system, and there's various factions. The most important faction that we're concerned about are the Bene Gesserit, which are women that run a long-term breeding program, and they have used their knowledge to basically make themselves superior fighting machines with semi-prescient powers who can use drugs to look into quote-unquote other memory and recall information from past lives. All
yes,
the rulers,
and more so than that, they also have kind of complete control over their molecular biology.
Mm-hmm.
So part of becoming a Bene Gesserit is you take, it's called the water of life, but what it basically is a lethal dosage of melange or the spice from Dune or Arrakis or later Arrakis. And it will kill you if your training has not been done to the level where you can go into yourself and molecularly change the lethal substance to a non-lethal substance, which may sound like chemistry bullshit, but hey, it's a science fictional book,
right?
So we're not going to get hung up on that.
Right. And one of the hooks is that there are no computers because they had a massive war against artificial intelligence. So there are people that they have trained to have computer-like memories and computer-like capabilities, the mentats. And all
of their ships are driven by navigators, which are people that float about in tanks of spice gas.
Yes, and that gives them semi-prescience to go through fold space.
Yes, which is more or less hyperspace or light speed, and they don't run into planets or asteroids. I think the other important thing we need to mention right now, right off the bat, is this is a sci-fi series that includes 0 aliens.
There are 0 aliens and nearly no people who are not white. Very few
I guess
non-white people.
But and more importantly is there's no aliens, and so, but because of the 10,000 years in the future and everything and going out into space, definitely there are different factions that may appear less human than others. Like the navigators are thin bodies floating in things with huge heads that don't necessarily look human, but they started out as human. Like every person in this story started out as human.
Yes, and the Tlaxu are elven-looking, gray-skinned people, and the Bene Gesserit are largely extremely attractive super women, and
that want to breed you, but only for their program.
Right. I wouldn't say there are no white people. It's just it's so far in the future that society is now homogenous racially, largely. It's not mentioned a whole lot, you know. The Fremen are brown-skinned because they live in a desert, but they also have red hair, which historically is accurate because there were red-haired Mongolians back in the day, and I'm pretty sure there still are. So it's not unheard of. And it's largely homogenous. But in any case, the ruling factions are all men. All the rulers are men, but they're also men who are usually married to Bene Gesserits and who are products of the Bene Gesserit breeding program. So the Bene Gesserits are like the under power group running everything.
Yeah, I mean more so like the shadow power group, because I think even in the first Dune book, Emperor Shaddam was Bene Gesserit. Like all the great houses were part of the Bene Gesserit breeding program, whether they knew it or not.
Oh, Shaddam's wife was a Bene Gesserit, and his mother, I think, was a Bene Gesserit. So these women are there, all the time, and they're
and this might be this is a spoiler, but we already did the spoiler alert up top, but. Lady Jessica is the daughter of the Baron Harkonnen.
Mm-hmm.
So the Bene Gesserit breeding program doesn't really care about your last name, but they care about your lineage, and they want to take the best genetic material from each house or each line, because their ultimate goal was to create and you can say it because you listened to it, the Kwisatz Haderach.
Yeah, Kwisatz Haderach. Yes, their ultimate goal is to create a man that can survive the spice agony, essentially. And they say, the shortening of the way, the man who can look into the darkness that no Bene Gesserit can go, all this nonsense. All it is a man who can survive the spice agony and control his molecular processes.
But also can have the other memory of both male and female lineages.
Absolutely.
Because the Bene Gesserit can only tap into the female other memory of their lineage. And the Bene Gesserit also do something called sharing. So one Bene Gesserit might be of one lineage and has all those other memory. But if they share with somebody of another lineage, they have all their other memory too. So it's almost like downloading other data files, which is very interesting with the way the last two books turned out. Or the last three even kind of, like the last one Frank wrote was leaning in this direction and stuff. So it's kind of interesting that the Bene Gesserit would download or, share.
Yes. So I would say that the first three books are basically a feudal war in space type story.
Yeah, very much so.
And it's very entertaining.
It's very entertaining, and it's very political. There's a lot of fucked up stuff that goes on. And one of the things, even in the first book, was plans within plans within plans. So, and that's an excellent summation for the whole series. Because just because it looks this way on the surface doesn't mean that's how it's going to turn out.
Yeah, the whole idea is that everybody is a superhuman because of this breeding program. Everybody who is a ruling person who's making decisions is a superhuman.
Yeah.
On purpose, and their machinations are extremely complex.
Yes, and because they think in eons. Well, the Bene Gesserit think in eons, and a lot of these male head of houses, even Duke Leto Atreides and Baron Harkonnen and Emperor Shaddam, were only thinking kind of in the present day. They weren't necessarily thinking 100, 200, 10,000 years in the future, right?
Right. The men are very short-sighted usually.
But the Bene Gesserit were, and they have been, and they always have been, and they knew it was going to be a long thing, and they get called witches in every single book. Everybody kind of hates them or despises them. Not everybody, but a lot of the ruling men do, And
which
some
is
of the
weird
other people,
because they're all products of the Bene Gesserit,
married to them, and mostly married
to the
Bene
Gesserit, and they're all tied in with the Bene Gesserit, all of them, even the homosexual men.
Man, let's talk about that real quick. So I had never read the books, and I watched the newest Dune movie, which was, I thought, phenomenal, and they made the Baron, but they didn't make the Baron as fucking perverted and disgusting as he is in the books. I mean, no,
he was menacing, but he wasn't a child molester, murderer.
Oh my god,
torturer,
and he had all these young men, and he was trying to bang all these young men that looked exactly like Paul Atreides in the first book, and he's like, I'm going to have him back to my chambers because he looks just like Paul, and it's like, oh my god. Also, I want to mention, and I don't know if you know this, Mike, but the first Dune book Frank shopped it around and nobody wanted to publish it. And it got published by an automotive manual manufacturer or publisher.
I knew that he had issues. I didn't know that it was an automotive manufacturer, though.
Yeah.
Or
If
yeah.
any of you are car people or gearheads or whatever they call them, if you pick up a copy of the first Dune book and go to the inner flap, it says it'll tell you the first published, right? Because all books do. And it's one of the big automotive manual publishers.
Oh, now I can't remember it.
Yeah, I can't remember it either.
It called? I have a couple of them. I know that.
Yeah.
For my 4-wheeler, my S10, and
yeah. But it was funny because it was like I saw a meme or something, and it was like Frank's like, "Hey, I got this great book," and all the publishers like, "Nah." And then he goes to this automotive handbook publisher, and they're like, "This is kind of neat. Why not?" And they publish it, and it becomes like a #1 hit. So
J.K. Rowling had issues too.
Yeah, and still does, from what I've heard. But
yeah, well, separate.
We're not talking about that. We're talking about Dune.
But yeah, it sucks you in. It's kind of like trying to talk about Lord of the Rings. It's so complex, but the overarching idea is that there's these factions. So the Tleilaxu they don't ultimately have women. They breed through taking women and turning them into machines and having them be baby factories, more or less. And they don't have women as an active part of society.
Let's talk about that for just a quick second, because that revelation didn't happen until post God Emperor of Dune.
Yeah.
Really.
Yep.
I mean, he just mentioned the Tleilaxu had axolotl tanks. Axolotl tanks. And the way that it was written, even the Bene Gesserit, like nobody knew what these tanks were. And they just kind of like, I don't know, I guess me as a modern day person just assumed they were, like a cylindrical glass tank full of water, because most tanks in sci-fi movies are cylindrical tanks of water, right? Or some kind of fluid. And it wasn't until the honored matres that you finally learned that the Tleilaxu thought that women were of absolutely zero value. And they would kind of chemically lobotomize them and turn them into a living but heavily reliant on, medical applications, oxygenators and things and whatnot. They'd have them hook up to all these medical contraptions and turn them into basically just living wombs.
Yes.
And that was it. Like the brain function would cease, and they would just keep them alive enough to be a womb. And that was a huge revelation within the series. And you don't get there until later. So you have to read several books before you even get to that point where you're like, this is fucked up.
Well, it falls within the part of the Dune universe is the juxtaposition of opposing viewpoints that are both wrong.
Yeah.
So you have the Harkonnens and the Atreides. You have environmentalism versus industrialization. You have the Bene Gesserits that don't believe in love, and men are only sperm donors, and women rule society, versus, the Tleilaxu, who are the exact opposite.
Yes.
And that's where Leto II tries to tie it all in and tamper all of these factions down.
Well, that's why Lady Jessica was outcast from the Bene Gesserit in the first few books, because she chose love over the Bene Gesserit way.
Yes.
And she chose to have Paul instead of terminating that pregnancy to have a female, because the Bene Gesserits were supposed to only have females.
Yes. Well, they could have males, but only under
certain
circumstances.
Yeah, and if they knew it was if it was going to be a potential, that word, the KH.
Kwisatz Haderach.
Yes. And Mike's listened to the audiobook, and I only read it, so I don't want to keep butchering the term, but it does come up in most every book, so but
I'm sure you had a pigeon in your head of what it was.
Yeah. But she chose to have Paul, much to the dismay of the Bene Gesserit, and he chose ultimately love over the Bene Gesserit way, even though he survived the spice agony and was quote unquote a full Reverend Mother, I guess,
right,
for lack of a better term. And he chose Chani over Princess Irulan. Okay. This will be a common theme in this episode. Mike will correct my pronunciations of all of the names.
It's not correcting. It's so that people know. Princess Irulan,
Yes.
who was physically perfect because she was a product of the Bene Gesserit breeding program.
Yes. And I thought the interesting thing was that Paul was kind of a massive, massive dick to her. And in the end, she chose Paul's side.
Yes, well, in the extended Dune universe, there's a lot of more information that gets out there, of course.
Okay, yeah, for sure.
Yeah. He wasn't that much of a dick to her, but she was also a dick to him because she put Cheney on birth control.
Well, yeah.
Which
I'm not
think
I'm
it'd
not
be possible in that universe. You wouldn't think that would be possible, but
yeah. Well, and that's the whole thing is there's a lot of things that are possible in this universe that kind of defy logic or even the universe itself that he set up. So, but it's all plans within plans within plans. And even in the last couple books, they have, we can talk about face dancers real quick, is the Telexu developed face dancers and they can mimic other people just by a touch. Like you shake their hand and then they can mimic your look, appearance, and voice. And in some cases, memories, I guess. And kind of the culmination is there's these new breed of face dancers that are almost undetectable, even by truthsayers. And the Bene Gesserit have truthsayers who dope up on the spice and can basically tell if you're lying or not. And these new face dancers could even fool the truthsayers, which it wasn't hammered home, which I really enjoyed about the whole series, is nothing was really hammered home as a modern movie or book or something would be today, where you have to like lay it out and lay it out again and remind the reader again that this is why. But there was something in the last book that Aramis, correct me, Mike, on the pronunciation.
You're so far off that I don't. Who's Aramis?
Omnius's counterpart.
Oh, Erasmus.
Oh my God. Okay, Erasmus.
Erasmus, Omnius, right?
I know. So Erasmus said something just fleetingly. It was one sentence. And he said that the new face dancers were so much sleeper cell agents that a lot of them believed that they were human. They didn't even know they were face dancers. So that's how they could beat the truthsayers. But it was like one sentence, one bit of dialogue in the last book. And it explained how the rabbi could have gone so long undetected as a face dancer. Because on the No ship that Duncan was on, after they fled Chapter House, they had a saboteur, and
they had saboteurs because Fufir Hawat was also a face dancer who
that is correct.
Believed he was Fufir Hawat.
Yes. And but they used the last bit of their melange. Oh yeah, I like when my wife wears melangerie. And anyway, but the only way to defeat a truthsayer would be to fully believe, right, your story. And that's kind of what they relied on. But the Bene Gesserit on the No ship consumed the last bit of their ultra potent spice to do the big truth trials with the entire population of the ship, which had been out in the universe for 25 years?
Something like that, yeah.
And I remember they landed on a planet and they were like, this is the first time some of the population has ever been on a planet because, they're on a no ship for 25 years. They're going to bang, and the Bene Gesserit are going to keep their breeding program going. So they're going to keep creating their breeding program and keep creating kids and things because they were hoping to be the new seed of the Bene Gesserit chapter house somewhere. But it's things like that where it's like it's the one sentence and they don't hammer it home. It's just like if you're paying attention, you're like, oh, okay. So they designed these new face dancers to actually believe they were who they were pretending to be. And they didn't even know they were a face dancer necessarily.
Yeah, that's one of the things I really appreciated about Dune as an adult reader was the subtlety and the lack of hand-holding. So I didn't notice this the first time I went through the series, but I did the second. Norma Senva was mentioned in God Emperor of Dune, and then she was like in one line, and then she was mentioned again in Chapter House or Heretics, and then she shows up again in Sandworms of Dune, and she's a super important character in the last book.
The Oracle of Time.
The person who invented space travel as we know it and spice prescience as we know it, and all of this important stuff, but there was no hand holding to show you how important this person was.
No, absolutely not. And I'll tell you that we heard about the Butlerian Jihad, and it didn't really go into depth about what was all going on until I got to Hunters of Dune, which is the first book that Brian and Kevin wrote. But they had also previously written the kind of the Butlerian Jihad trilogy with Serena Butler and everything like that. And that's the big war against the thinking machines. And I remember texting you, Mike, and saying, man, I wish I would have read that trilogy before finishing up the series here. But, and I'll go back and I'll read these things because, I did enjoy this whole series, but that's kind of outside the main scope of the main timeline. So you don't necessarily have to, but I feel like the last two books would have been a little bit more impactful had I read that trilogy.
Right. And I have read the trilogy and it is good. So
yes.
As an aside, I'm definitely halfway through.
Oh, me too.
Definitely halfway through my cigar.
And I like
it's fantastic.
I don't think there's been a flavor change, but it's been consistent. What?
Mine's getting darker. It's getting stronger and darker. And
okay.
I like it.
And you know what?
Good.
I just said, I don't think there's been a flavor change, and I took a big puff, and I'm like, this is darker now. So I think I just hit that flavor change.
So anyway, yeah, they don't handhold you, and we all know about the Butlerian Jihad because the strictures of not creating a machine that thinks like a man is ever present, but we don't really know anything about the characters who are involved with the jihad.
Yes.
Which makes a big comeback.
It does. A huge comeback in the last two books, or last three, really, because Frank was setting it up in the last one that he wrote with the Tachyon Net and fleeing Chapter House and being searched for. But I was going to say that this, is it Norma?
Yes.
Because she invented the Holtzman engines, but they're named after Holtzman. So I kind of want to read that story about how she invented it, but this guy Holtzman took credit.
That is the Butlerian Jihad trilogy.
Okay, so that's definitely one that I need to read. But that was very, very interesting, and I think everything's super interesting. They kind of bring you in with Dune, and spice is really interesting, and the things that it can do.
Spice is gasoline or petroleum, because everything is made from spice, just like everything is made from petroleum in our modern society. Like I say, there's messages in there about society. It's just not, you have to analyze it.
Well, it's not heavy-handed.
No. Dune had to be rewritten because the first version was a little heavy-handed with the spice is petroleum concept.
Okay.
And the planetologist was the main character, not Paul.
Oh, okay. Yes. So I wanted to talk about Liet Kynes briefly.
Yep.
And you and I had a little bit of a disagreement on the new Dune movie, and you were upset that they made Liet Kynes a female.
Yes.
And I said, well, that doesn't bother me. And you said, oh, but it will. And I've read all 8 books, and it still doesn't bother me that Liet Kynes was a female in the movie.
It bothers me because in the Dune universe, all powerful women are Bene Gesserit, and Liet Kynes isn't a Bene Gesserit woman. You know what I mean? That's part of the universe.
But she's Fremen.
That's
or
true,
he's Fremen.
Too. Well,
so,
he's Fremen, she's Fremen. I will make an exception for that. I've watched the Dune movie now again. Twice, I think. And I'm a bigger fan of it now than I was the first time I watched it. And the first time I watched it, I really liked it. So,
yeah. And I really liked the Dune, the newest Dune movie. And I'm excited for the second part. I know they're not going to, if they're taking 2 movies to do the first book, there's no way they're going to do all 8 of the books.
No, I think that our best case scenario is they'll go through Children of Dune and then be done with it. And they might do a little preview of God Emperor, just like a flash of Leto as full sandworm.
Yeah.
And that's fine.
I mean, and who knows? Awesome. They might do a Netflix miniseries or something that kind of rounds out the rest of it, but it won't be the original actors from the movie.
HBO might do a series.
Somebody might do
cool.
one.
Well, HBO owns the rights.
Oh, okay. I didn't know that.
Yeah, there's good odds that it'll be good.
Yeah, I was just saying, like, in today's society, if you've got a good story and a good IP, there's a good chance somebody's going to pick it up and do a miniseries. So, but I didn't know HBO owned the rights. I would watch it too.
If HBO came up with a Dune miniseries, I would pay for HBO. So, but I'm a Dune fan.
But going back to Liet Kynes, Liet Kynes comes back in the last 2 books because the Bene Gesserit fully embrace the Gola program, and they get volunteers from amongst their ranks to be converted to these tanks. And it's a kind of a major plot point because they pick up this group of Jews led by the rabbi, who is a face dancer.
Becomes a face dancer.
Yes, that we find out later, and becomes one of the new face dancers that's almost undetectable. And his chosen woman became a Bene Gesserit and then volunteered to be a tank. And so he felt this huge amount of grief and whatever remorse and refused to leave her side even when she was a tank and basically brain dead. But they embrace their own program, and they bring back all of these people from history because, lo and behold, the Talaxu have been gathering samples shortly after the deaths of all of these people. And you have to gather the cells right after the death to get all of their life memories back, because that's a huge part of the Gola program, is you have to reinstate their memories so they can fully become who they were to begin with. And so they bring back Stilgar and Liet Kynes, and even in their Gola lives, there's no reason Liet Kynes couldn't have been a woman. So I think that switch was perfectly fine with me.
It's not that it's not fine. I think it hurts the gender politics between the Bene Gesserit and the Talaxu, because there's that juxtaposition, and it will never be explored in the movies. So for the movie context, it's fine.
Yeah, I guess. But they had cells of Lady Jessica.
Mm-hmm.
So and I don't know why they wouldn't. Yeah, and I don't know why they wouldn't have taken cells from Liet Kynes, regardless of gender.
It's not regardless of gender. It's just, it takes away from the internal politics of the universe. You know what I mean? It's not like I'm a diehard against it. I guess I don't really see when it comes to that.
I don't really see how it takes away from the gender politics of the universe, because you have a Serena Butler and you have Lady Jessica. And I mean, I guess I don't know Serena Butler's background, if she was Bene Gesserit or not, because that was so far in the past.
She was pre-Bene Gesserit order.
Pre-Bene Gesserit.
Yeah.
But a big name. And Lady Jessica was only a big name because she kind of stood against the Bene Gesserit, and she was the mother of Paul.
Right. And they had Cheney's
therefore linked
DNA.
To.
So.
Yeah. And she was a Fremen woman, but she was linked to Paul. And Liet Kynes was father of Cheney. And if Liet Kynes was mother of Cheney, I don't see why that would be a big issue.
Well, it's not. It's not. It's not a issue of damaging the story. It's more of, I like the paradigm of the Talaxu versus the Bene Gesserit a lot. I think it's hilarious.
Oh, I like it too.
They're both evil in their own way. You know what I mean?
Well, yes.
Like, even in the books, when you're reading, it's very clear that they're both not good. There are no good guys, quote unquote, in the Dune universe. Everybody's a bad guy, including the Atreides, who are supposed to be the good guys.
Well, and even people that are trying to be good are still vilified or whatever the word is.
They have villainous behavior. Nobody is a pure actor. Paul Atreides is not a perfect person.
No, and I think part of it is because he sets up this very, like you said, very faction-based, almost feudal landscape where, the Atreides value honor and loyalty to a fault in a lot of cases. I mean, that's how you get a million Golas of Duncan, Idaho, and Leto 2 just unceremoniously murders them and orders another one cooking, So he had like a standing order of, he always had Duncan Golas ready to go whenever he felt like killing the one, because the one got too knowledgeable or, had moral issue with the path Leto 2 was taking.
They mentioned one time later that Duncan, Idaho only lived a handful of full lives where he died peacefully in bed. Out of the 10,000 lives of Duncan, Idaho.
Yes. Well, and that was super interesting because later on, they say that the Tlaxu managed to culminate all of Duncan's other lives into their current Gola, whatever current Gola they were growing. So it was their own Tlaxu kind of breeding program almost, in a sense, where they kept tweaking him. And the Tlaxu would keep building in different things to their Golas to fit their own designs. And
it also needs to be said that the Tlaxu were Golas themselves.
Yes, of course.
So, yes.
And that was interesting because like Skytail and Waif have very short lifespans because of the accelerated stuff. But on Tlaxu, they always had all of the tanks ready and they had other Golas growing. So it didn't necessarily matter if their lifespan was 20 years versus 80 years, or with the spice life enhancing capabilities 100 years or 200 years or whatever it was.
Well,
they were always
Tag
ready to
lived
go.
300 years and he did not use spice.
Yeah.
Through the breeding program, they led naturally longer and longer and longer lives. I think it was mentioned that the Fremen routinely lived to be 180, and they didn't have a breeding program.
Well, but they use spice.
But they use spice. Yeah,
so
it
spice,
double the natural lifespan.
Yeah, spice gives you an extra 90 years or 100 years or so, depending. Lifespans are interesting because even today, the lifespan is largely dependent on country that you live in and your own genealogy, of course.
And your lifestyle. Obviously.
Yes.
But yeah, I'm glad that you really enjoyed Dune.
I did. I'm excited to read at least the Butlerian Jihad. I know they did a whole bunch of house books. They did House Harkonnen and House Atreides, and they've done Bene Gesserit book and some other books. So
yeah. So the house books, Atreides, Harkonnen, and Carino take place before Dune, the original book. Okay. And then there's the Butlerian Jihad trilogy that takes place like thousands of years beforehand. And then they have the Caladan series, which is just coming out now. And I'm just starting that one. I haven't read it. And then they have Mentats, Navigators, and Sisterhood. And that takes place after the Jihad, almost immediately after the Jihad.
Okay. The Butlerian Jihad or Paul's Jihad?
Butlerian Jihad.
Okay.
It's the Sisterhood, the Mentats, and the Navigators is kind of like the creation of the society post-Butlerian Jihad.
Okay, so the creation of the factions.
Yep, the creation of the factions. How it kind of how the Landsrod got created. The Landsrod, we haven't mentioned it. The Landsrod is this house, or it's like a senate with all the major and minor houses. It's like a parliament, yeah. And the idea is that the Landsrod and the Imperial Court have equal levels of military power. They're like equals, quote unquote.
Yeah, and then you have Chom.
Yep, you have Chom, which is the banking guild, and they're the ones that control all the spice.
Yeah. And you have the spacing
the Navigators Guild. Yep, the Navigators Guild, who are the only ones who can do interstellar travel
for a time. The Ixians,
not even initially, but yes.
Yeah, and we didn't talk about the Ixians yet, but they do technology, so they do everything short of creating a thinking machine. And in God Emperor of Dune, Leto 2 is relying on them to basically build thinking machines for him, going against the convention against thinking machines.
Yes. Ix and the Rechases both build technology, but they're also houses in the Landsrod. That just happens to be their specialty. Each of the houses owns a certain number of planets, and they specialize in whatever they're selling to all the other groups.
Yes. And after the God Emperor of Dune, he kind of set off what they call the scattering. And so you have the old empire, which is kind of all the planets in the first 3 Dune books. And then after that, people scatter and go everywhere. And so the face dancers go out, and they kind of create this group of handlers and I'm trying to remember the name of those things. The Futars.
Futars, yep.
But they're all human. Like they all started as human, but it's been thousands of years, like tens of thousands of years or whatever it's been. And so these humans have developed to be more animalistic, and it's the same with the can't remember what they're called, but the diving population on the planet that gets the Soothstones.
Yeah, I can't remember them.
They're almost like, yes, they're almost like the Futars because they're more animalistic, but they still started as human at one point in time because there's no aliens in the whole series. It's all kind of evolution or breeding that has driven these big
or machines,
crevices,
or
machines. The machines come in, and we haven't talked about the machines yet, and we should, because that's kind of the culmination of the thing, because it's almost the second machine Butlerian Jihad type of thing.
Yes. So the scattering sent all these beings out, and they came into contact with Omnius's empire. And that's how the face dancers, the super duper face dancers, were created by Omnius, by Erasmus.
Yes. And Omnius was the OG thinking machine, and he created like different nodes of himself and survived the Butlerian Jihad. And Erasmus was more I would almost if we're doing like modern day comparisons, Omnius is maybe more of a Trump, and Erasmus is more of like a shadow player, kind of like pulling the puppet strings. So he knows Omnius's weaknesses and strengths and fed him data to let him, quote unquote, jump to his own conclusions to do things that would only better Erasmus's ultimate goals.
Yes. Erasmus was an independent robot.
Yes. Who was more interested in, so all the new face dancers would come back and basically download all of the data of all of the humans that they had interacted with, all of their other memory, quote unquote, right? And Erasmus would download that because he was trying to figure out the core of humanity, basically. Humans were fascinating to him, and he wanted to understand everything there was to know. And I really liked the last interactions between Duncan and Erasmus in the last book.
Yes, I like him too. It makes a lot more sense after you read the Butlerian Jihad. I'm not going to lie. But
yeah, I felt
it's very interesting. Yes. And if you look at when they were published, I think, the Butlerian Jihad was published before Sandworms and Hunters of Dune.
Yeah, because I think they didn't find those outlines until after they'd started publishing other things.
Yeah, the outlines were found in a safety deposit box or something like that.
Yeah, it was wild.
Yeah.
But they had started publishing like these side things based on other note scraps that Frank had made. And so they took those and kind of ran with them. And then they found the outline for the conclusion of the main timeline. So they kind of wove it all together. And I'd never really felt like I had to read other stuff in Dune until I read Hunters of Dune. And the first 2 chapters, I'm like, fuck, I should have read the Butlerian Jihad books before starting this, because that's when they started leaning heavily into that. And, it makes sense because they wrote those and they want to get you to read them on one hand, but maybe that was truly Frank's vision, was to tie the Butlerian Jihad back into the conclusion of the Dune main timeline. So,
there's no doubt. There's enough droppings. Oh, that's not a very nice way to put it. Enough droppings in the Frank Herbert written series to where it all ties in with the wheels within wheels that is Dune.
Yeah.
And it's so, I'm not saying it's super complex, but it is wheels within wheels. That's how everything operates.
Yes. There's a lot of, I don't know, I would almost say this is sci-fi second and kind of like political thriller first in some sense of the thing, because it depends on how you want to read it. But if you're going to read the whole full-on thing, it's almost more political than it is sci-fi. I mean, it's definitely sci-fi setting.
It's a sci-fi setting for a political intrigue type story. It's the sci-fi is almost secondary.
And I mean, it kind of punches all the buttons of things I like. Like, I like sci-fi, and I really enjoy the political intrigue where, people's motives and goals aren't clear up front. And it takes you some time to understand the complexities of everything, because even though there's a limited, a finite number of factions, they all have kind of long-term goals outside of some of the male leaders, Duke Leto Atreides, what did he want? He wanted to use desert power and keep banging his hot wife, Lady Jessica. Baron Harkonnen wanted to keep banging underage dudes that look like Paul.
And rape and torture and murder and be a
well,
nasty
yeah,
person
all
in
that
general.
stuff, and it was interesting because like they brought back, not they, but like the face dancers brought back Baron Harkonnen, and he got to start turning Caladan into an industrial wasteland. So he was kind of, I don't want to, maybe the America, the United States of the universe, where he wanted to turn everything into like an industrial hellscape and then rape and torture people.
Oh, yes. Dune, just like Lord of the Rings, definitely has an not anti-capitalistic, but anti-all-out rape and pillage attitude,
To the destruction of the natural environment. So, it was very pro-ecology. And I read somewhere that Frank was very interested in, I don't know if terraforming is the right word, but kind of like the ecological cycles. And that's why Dune was, so pivotal.
Yeah. Frank Herbert was a Republican too. Interestingly enough, he was like a campaign manager for several Republicans before he was.
Oh, okay.
He was always a writer, but yeah, he was a Republican and he was a speech writer. So he was like old school Republican though, before it was all about like the modern Republican Party. You know what I mean? He was like the hangover from the FDR years style Republican.
Yeah.
Yeah, where like, it was a little bit more, in my opinion, reasonable, but very interesting. I read the Frank Herbert biography by Brian Herbert as well.
Okay.
So, and that's a good read too.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
I'll have to delve more into it. I know the 8 books for me, they weren't really a struggle because I thoroughly enjoyed all of them, even the ones that I rated a 4 out of 5 instead of a 5 out of 5. But I mean, it is 8 books. And outside of the follow-up to Dune, which is very, very short, Dune Messiah, I think, was the shortest of the whole bunch.
Yes.
It's a lot of time spent in that universe. And so there is some kind of, universe or IP fatigue kind of going through all 8 of them.
Well, yeah, the first 6 books took 20 years. And then the last 2 you read were 20 years after that. So, yeah, there's definitely, when you read them all as a group, it's kind of like reading Harry Potter. When 1 book a year was the thing, it was a lot easier to read all the Harry Potters. Now, if we were to sit down, granted they're young adult novels, I could probably read them in a month, but I'm sure I'd get tired of reading Harry Potter.
Yeah, and I only read Harry Potter after they were all done and after the movies were mostly done. And I didn't really get the fatigue with them because they were written for the age group that the main characters were. So the first one is kind of very much like, I don't know, middle school-ish level. And then it kind of ramps up, but you're only ever getting to like high school level. Whereas Dune, there's so much going on and so many different factions and so much political things going on in the background that aren't, and they're not handed to you. So it is a little bit of work to try and like keep all this stuff in your mind as you're reading through them. So when you get 4 books in, you're like, I've been spending an awful lot of time in this universe. I kind of need to read something else before I get to the next book. And so it took me a while. Let me pull it up.
Yeah,
I will tell you.
Dune
when I read the first
actually
book,
changed the way that I interact with people at work. Isn't that interesting? I try to do more wheels and plans within plans.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, I definitely did change the way that I do things with like my long-term planning.
So here's what it says. I read Dune between March of 2022 and April of 2022. So it's taken me a full year to read all 8 Dune books. Not necessarily because of the length, but, we read Animal Farm, Slaughterhouse 5, Lord of the Flies for the podcast in between those. And I read a couple other books in between those, mostly just as kind of like a break, like I felt almost too involved in Dune and I needed kind of like a palate cleanser before I went to the next book. Not because they're overly laborious, but I mean, it's a lot of stuff to take in.
Right, and Dune they're written for college level readers. They're not simple.
Yeah, for sure.
I've listened to a lot of audiobooks between, I can tell you that. And I've read several books as well. I've been on a
But I do.
Chomsky kick lately, and it's really depressing.
Okay, I don't think I've read any Noam Chomsky, and I know we briefly mentioned that last episode.
It's fairly predictable, but it's depressing.
Yeah, I mean most things are, if you think about them. But alas, this is a Dune episode and not a depressing episode. I mean, there's a lot of depressing things in Dune, to be fair.
Yeah, it's not always, mostly it's not very happy. I'm not going to lie.
Yeah. I was very happy that Leto 2 was one of the Golas in the last two books. And like I said, I think he's my favorite character, even though he didn't really play a huge part. I guess he did play a huge part in the last two books, in the last book, being specific, because he basically told the sandworms to fuck some shit up on Synchrony, or Synchrony, the thinking machine planet.
I think it's supposed to be Synchrony.
Okay, Synchrony.
Yeah.
And that was cool. And then he got to rejoin with his pearl of wisdom that in God Emperor of Dune, he sent out his consciousness into each then new sandworm. So they were all kind of him. So he kind of did his own like mini Gola project. But
yeah, Leto, he was interesting because he was kind of a one-man band that had his own breeding program. And he had these massive plans that nobody else was aware of that came to fruition in the end. So it was really satisfying.
Yeah. And a lot of the stuff that he, like you said, a lot of stuff that he did, like came back in the end and made everything possible and made the conclusion of the entire series possible because of what he did. And it bought Duncan all the time he needed at the end to finally realize. But it took Paul to tell Duncan that Duncan was the one, to kind of kick Duncan off into his full-on role, which is interesting because that's the whole point of Golas, is you need kind of like an inciting incident, whether it's like crazy sex with a Bene Gesserit or they fucking drowned Stilgar to get his memories back, you know, and a Fremen who held all water sacred, and they put him in an excess of water, right, to trigger his memories. And Duncan had all this latent stuff that needed an additional kick. Like he already had his Gola memories back, but he needed that additional kick to get to his full potential.
Yeah, it's
which he wouldn't have had if Leto 2 hadn't bred the Atreides to be invisible from prescience.
Yes, and like I say, I think you mentioned it first. It's more of a political intrigue story than it is sci-fi. But it is sci-fi too, don't get me wrong.
Oh, for sure, yeah. But that's what's super cool about it, I think. It's not just sci-fi for sci-fi's sake. And I would say most of the Star Treks, right? Like the original Star Trek and Next Generation and stuff like that, they're all kind of, the Star Treks are kind of like morality plays set in a sci-fi universe to make them palatable. And I don't know that Dune's any different, you know, but they tackle really heavy things set in a sci-fi thing. So it's not like, hey, this is here and now, even though it is kind of here and now.
Yeah. That's what good sci-fi is, though, right? It's not a story about magic things or technology. It's a story about important things set in a sci-fi setting to make it palatable. So it's kind of like Deep Space Nine, which is my favorite Star Trek. That's a political intrigue story. And a war story set in a sci-fi universe.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
So I know that I listened to the audiobooks.
Who controls the wormhole?
Yeah, he who controls the wormhole controls it all.
Or he who controls the spice controls it all.
Right. Yep. Like I say, spice is petroleum, people.
Yes. Well, let's talk about the Honored Matres for a second, because I thought their origin story was very fascinating, and you don't get that in the first. And I think that's the great thing about Dune, is Dune introduces all these people, and it's not till a couple books later that you find out their origin story and who they are and what they kind of stand for. And so the Honored Matres were just kind of these like war-hungry women that were crazy, and they had their own version of spice which was adrenaline from their dying victims. And they would somehow harvest that and ingest that. And they had orange flecked eyes instead of the blue and blue of the spice addicts, as it were.
Yes, and they used
started
sex
out
as a political weapon to control all the men that they interacted with.
Yes, and that's disgusting. And where can I find one?
Right.
No,
exactly.
I'm sorry. Anyway, and it was interesting because one of the Duncan Golas was trained as an anti-honored matri sex thing, so he could break honored matries and things. So that was an interesting play as well in there. But the honored matries started as exodal tanks.
Yep. Yeah, they were
And so
Tlaxu women who were saved.
And they hated the Tlaxu, and so they got out of their tank status and waged an unholy war on all Tlaxu, which kind of then expanded and spilled out to anybody who stood in their way. But it's a very sympathetic mission statement, I guess. Not that that was their mission statement, but hearing their origin story, it's hard not to feel empathy for them.
Yes. Yeah.
Which is interesting because it's the same as the Bene Gesserit, because in the first few books, the Bene Gesserit are these evil witches who have these evil plans and do these evil things. And then later on, you're rooting for the Bene Gesserit against the Honored Matries, against the Tlaxu, against the thinking machine army. And the first few books of Honored Matries are like, these women are crazy and psychotic and evil and evil and evil. And then you're like, oh, but that's their origin story, so maybe they're not as evil as we thought. And maybe that's the greatest part about Dune is you can get these people that you think are evil because of what they're doing, but he's asking you to sit there and think about what led to their decisions. And that's the ultimate point of the ultimate book, the last book, right? Is the Duncan is the ultimate Kizwatch Hatterach or Watchamash, right? And
yep. And he's the Sasquatch.
He's the Samsquanch, and he needs to bridge the gap between the thinking machines and the humans, just like they had to bridge the gap between the Honored Matries, or Murbella had to bridge the gap between the Honored Matries and the Bene Gesserit to create the New Order, and just like Paul had to bridge the gap between this, and Leto had to bridge the gap between that, and it's all about finding that common ground.
Yes. Well, that's, I think, one of the overarching messages is like the middle way. It's one of those, the middle way is usually the correct way, not the extreme.
Yes. Find what you
by
can.
The way, go ahead.
Yes. I was just going to say, find what you can agree on and then figure out everything else. And that was kind of the coolest thing about Erasmus was he wasn't bloodthirsty like Omnius was. Because he was actually seeking understanding, maybe not in the correct way, but I did enjoy Crone when he came all in. He was all like puffed up and like, oh yeah, well, Erasmus, guess what? Like, we've had our own plans, and Erasmus is like laughing at him. And like, there's a whole like couple pages on Erasmus picking the right laughter samples from his databanks to like laugh in Crone's face. And Crone's just getting like saltier and saltier. And then Erasmus is like, come on, like, you're fucking stupid. Of course I knew. Also, I built in a kill switch, so you're all fucking dead now. Like, it's hilarious.
Oh, it's fucking funny. It was like I say, it had a very satisfying end. It was not a Stephen King novel.
Not at all. Not at all. Stephen King is good for 3/4 of the book. Mostly, there's some books that are outside of that rule, but
the Dark Tower was good all the way up until the last like 25 pages.
Okay, my favorite Stephen King book is Pet Sematary. I think that's literary gold. The other ones, I think The Stand is good. I haven't read some of the other ones, but a lot of the other books are so good. And then at the very end, he wants to toss in like 13 other things. And I always think to myself, man, Stephen, you had me freaked out about this killer clown. Why are you bringing in a giant spider at the end?
Mm-hmm.
Like, I'm all freaked out about the clown. I don't need the giant spider. Just give me the clown thing. Let's just stick with that.
I like The Shining. The Shining was good. but I think
Okay,
that's
yeah,
colored by
yeah.
the movie too.
Oh, the movie, the Stanley Kubrick movie is great. He hated that one though, and he made a made-for-TV one that
I've
followed
seen
the
that
book a
one.
lot more closely.
Yeah.
So, anyway, go on with we're doing Dune. We're not trying to do Stephen King,
Yes.
but
I was
yeah,
gonna say
satisfying endings.
I'm in my last half of an inch, and I need a roach clip because it's definitely getting hot, but it still tastes wonderful in my opinion.
Yeah, this one's great.
Yeah, the
I really
MX2s
enjoy
are
this.
phenomenal. If you see one and you haven't had one, try it. They're good.
Yes, indeed.
So,
Anything else you wanted to talk about Dune?
no, just Wheels Within Wheels, and if you read it, it will change the way you interact with the world, especially when you're trying to do long-term planning with people
Yeah.
that you perceive as nefarious actors.
Or even people you perceive as friends.
Possibly. Yeah, possibly. If you want to be a real prick.
Possibly. Well, I mean, you don't have to be a prick about it, but you have to understand. I mean, the whole point about Dune is everybody has their own agenda, and
Yeah.
you never know the timeline of somebody else's agenda.
Right.
Because Crone, he was one of the new face dancers, had an agenda, and he was so smug throughout the last 3 books or whatever, right? Or the 2 books or whatever it was. And he was so smug, and he was always thinking to himself like, well, the Omnius has no idea, and so-and-so has no idea, because they would go and infiltrate all these other things and replace Bene Gesserits and Ixians and Talaxu with face dancers. And so he really felt, and even like the Spacing Guild people with face dancers, and so they kind of brought about a big loss in the Navigators and a big loss in the Bene Gesserit and a big loss in all these other factions. But in the end, it didn't matter because Erasmus's agenda was a lot more long-term than Crone's was, and Crone thought his was long-term.
Yeah, he was around for a couple hundred years.
Yeah.
Which is
and
nothing
he thought
in
his
the
was
time span
long-term.
of 15,000 years.
Oh, no, for sure. But that's what I mean. Like, even if you have a friend or somebody that you think is a friend at work or wherever, and they're doing some weird things, and you're like, well, that's kind of weird, but you know what? They're my friend. It's no big deal. But you never know what their timeline is. Their timeline could be a week or 2 weeks or a couple months, or it could be a couple years, or it could be, I mean, like in modern society, it's not going to be 100 years because that'd be some weird level bullshit. But
yeah, it's all about your time frame and what your goals are, and spreading out your wheels, multiple plans of action, different avenues.
And that was kind of the thing was in the last couple of books, right? Like Omnius, they thought they had the one Quizrach Haderach. I'm still not saying that right, I don't think.
Quizrach Haderach. And he was only one of many. One of many.
Well, yeah, and Paulo, right? They had Paul Atreides, but they named him Paulo and gave him to Baron Harkonnen's Gola to subvert. And they thought they had the one, and then they wanted the other one, which they thought was Paul Atreides from the No Ship, which turned out to be Duncan, not even Leto or any of the other people that they had grown as Golas. But they were so sure it was Paul, the Paul Gola, whether it was Paulo or Paul, and they knew it was one of the two, or they thought they knew it was one of the two.
Yeah, and it was.
And Omnius even said, like, Omnius was like, well, even if the one is dead, we still have the other one. It doesn't matter. But ultimately it did, because the plans within plans within plans, or the timeline of the agenda. And it ended up being Erasmus who kind of fucked Omnius over, which is probably a good thing because Omnius's goals were completely different than Erasmus's goals.
Right. Very interesting. People who haven't read it should go out there and do it. Even though we did throw some spoilers in, it's still worth a read.
Well, there's spoilers, and I think there's so much, though, that even if you listen to this and you haven't read them, if anything we've said has seemed interesting, I don't think that by the time you get to the 8th book, I don't know how much of what we talked about on this episode you'll remember. And there's so much more complexity to it than we could ever possibly talk about in an hour and a half on an episode. So it's still definitely worth it. And I guess I'll ask, I have a question for you, Mike.
What's that?
That is, after having read the main 8-book trilogy, I'm going all Douglas Adams, Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy trilogy in 5 parts is how he bills his his series. So having read the full 8-book main timeline series, is my next stop the Butlerian Jihad, or what would you say my next reading
I would
within
say
the Dune
Butlerian
universe
Jihad.
would be?
Yeah,
Okay.
Butlerian Jihad. Like I say, the House series takes place pre-Dune, but with all the main Dune characters. And then you have let's see here. I'm looking at the list right here. Oh, come on now. Paul of Dune, The Winds of Dune. That takes place between Dune and Dune Messiah, basically.
Okay.
So that takes place with like during Paul's jihad. But I would say that the Butlerian Jihad books are gold. They're winners. You'll like them.
Okay, yeah. That was kind of like my inkling after reading the full 8 books. And even before I finished, well, when I started book 7, I remember, and I said this earlier in the episode, that I texted you and I said, man, I wish before book 7 I would have read the Butlerian Jihad stuff.
Yeah, the Butlerian Jihad is, you have to read that before you can read like the Schools of Dune series, for sure.
Okay.
And then if you're still interested, you could read the other ones too.
Yeah, I feel like essential reading, though, is probably the 8 main series books and then the Butlerian Jihad trilogy, and everything else is kind of like icing on the cake, probably.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not obsessed with the Dune universe, but I really enjoy it, so I'm just kind of going through as they come out. Like, the Heir of Caladan came out last year, so I haven't read that yet, but
okay,
it's on the list. So
yes. But I guess the good news is, like, it's his son, and going largely based off of a lot of notes and things that they found, or that he found. And, it's at least within the spirit of Frank and what
they're
Frank
good.
might have wanted. So it's not a complete, and you know what? There wasn't a huge tonal shift. It was a little bit of a shift in writing style between the last book Frank wrote and the first book Brian and Kevin wrote, but it wasn't drastically so. It still very much felt like Dune and like Frank was writing.
Yeah,
in a sense.
They do a good job.
So I think that's one where, I know that they're doing it because they make money off of it, but I feel like they're also doing it because they really love the series that Frank started, and they found a lot of notes and things that he left behind, kind of like Christopher Tolkien did with Lord of the Rings and everything. So I don't feel like it's a complete money grab, although that is certainly part of it, I'm sure. But I think they're trying to do it as close to what Frank would have wanted as possible, which is great because it seems like they're good stewards of the franchise.
Yeah, I agree. And Brian Herbert, he's getting old too. So soon Dune will be done entirely. And it's not like reading Star Trek or Star Wars books, which I've read a few, which they're different. They have totally different authors. So of course they're going to be tonally different.
For sure, yeah.
So
it's nice to have good stewards of the franchise that are continuing to put out stuff.
Yes. I mean, I think that whatever Dune properties come out 20 years from now on the screen, it's probably not going to be as good as what's going to happen now, because Brian will certainly be dead by then. He's 75 now. So,
and it kind of depends on what they do with the rights and everything, after Brian passes on, and Kevin and whatnot.
Yes.
But I think that there's 8 books in the main timeline, and there's at least as many, if not more, books in the, I don't know what you call it, the other supplemental materials, or
the
supplemental
Dune
stories.
Extended Universe. Yeah.
So there's plenty of material there. So as long as if you're making movies or stuff from it, you've got plenty. I don't think there's any filmmaker alive that could do all 8 Dune books in their lifetime.
Right.
Because I know it was Denis Villeneuve who did the first one. He's going to do part 2 of Dune, and he's got to be old. And even if he's not, if you take 2 movies to do 1 book, you're not gonna do all 8, because you could do the second one, you can do Children of Dune, but that's probably about it for a lifetime, just with production times and everything. So, there's going to be plenty of Dune stuff out there that people can do, and we wouldn't necessarily have to worry about the subversion of the Star Wars franchise, right? Because George Lucas opened it up to everybody and let everybody write Star Wars books. And so there's so many Star Wars books out there, some which are great and some which are not great. But I think with the Dune stuff, it kind of depends on what they do after Brian Brian passes on and what the family chooses to do with the franchise and the rights and everything. But I don't foresee somebody else coming in and making like Dune fan fiction kind of stuff that actually gets sold and published. And
No, I don't think so. And Kevin Anderson is 61 now, so he could do
okay,
more, but he's written a lot of books outside of Dune. So I don't know if he'd be
yeah,
interested in continuing that on or not.
yeah,
And
and I feel like kind of anything post Sandworms of Dune wouldn't be hugely interesting because that's kind of the whole point is the universe finds balance in
right. Yeah,
Sandworms of
none of the
Dune.
books take place after Sandworms. None of
So
the
all of this
extended
stuff
universe.
happens in that window, Butler and Jihad to Sandworms of Dune, and there's not much outside of that window. And you could supposedly
Yes.
write other stories about minor characters, but I don't know. I don't think the interest is there in the public eye, honestly.
No, not really.
We have the miniseries, the Dune miniseries, and then we have the Children of Dune miniseries, which I haven't watched yet. But that takes Dune Messiah and Children of Dune and combines it into one miniseries because Dune Messiah is a very short book,
Right.
and so you already have that, and those are two miniseries, and then you have the Sting movie. And then now we have the Denis Villeneuve part 1 and part 2. Part 2 is coming out soon. But I don't see the average movie goer necessarily wanting to see the full 8 books in the main timeline committed to film. I don't think the interest is there because, like
No,
we
it's
said,
not Marvel where
the
it's
first,
yeah.
the first 3 books are all kind of like you have Paul. Paul is kind of there and he can tie everything together. But after that, it gets weird, and you either like that weird or you don't. And that God Emperor of Dune book is kind of like, if you like that one, you're gonna like all of them, and if you don't like that one at all, you're not gonna like the rest of them because they only kind of get weirder from there, in a sense.
Yeah, you'd be totally lost. You have to read them in order. You can't just jump in at
No,
Hunters of Dune.
no, not at all.
You
So
could
I
jump
don't I don't
in
think that.
at God Emperor of Dune, I guess.
Yeah, but you'd be in for like one fucked up ride.
Right.
Um, but so like I'm not overly worried about that, like because a lot of times when people adapt things to film from a book, it's kind of like, well, okay, let's see how they do.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. So I am officially done with my cigar, by the way.
Me as well.
Where we go. What were your thoughts about the MX2?
This one's really good. I like it.
Yep.
I don't know what
I
the
love
price
it.
point is, but it's a great stick.
It's on the higher end of our normal range. You can get a stick for $9 at a cigar shop.
Okay.
Typically.
Well, the
So,
last one we smoked, I think, was it was almost $20 a stick, I think,
yeah.
for the
Yeah.
the LFD, and that was a phenomenal stick. But this one's really good.
Oh, yeah. I
And
would smoke
I
the
liked,
MX2 in place of the LFD any day.
yeah, I liked that this one got kind of darker and more pungent or more
Yep.
strong as we went along. Very good. I also highly recommend the Dune series. I'm glad there were a couple books, and I gave them a 4 out of 5, but I still really enjoyed them. But there are a few books where I was kind of like, what in the fuck is going on? But if you power through those brief moments, I think it's well worth it.
Yes, it's a very interesting read.
Because a lot of these plans within plans, wheels within wheels, take multiple generations in the characters' lives or in the characters' time frame to come to fruition. And the things that happened in God Emperor of Dune didn't fully come to fruition until the very last book.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So, if you want to know the full thing, you just got to do the full thing.
Yeah, yeah. It's almost, well, God Emperor, you're like lost in a lot of the reasoning behind things, and like it doesn't make a lot of sense, but it does in the end. It does come around.
Yes.
So,
And that's the great thing, and I think the thing that will hinder Dune from ever being a full-on 8-movie series thing, because it's so complex throughout it that
yeah, it's
even
not
in
superhero
that,
smash.
no,
It's
and
not
even in
superhero smash.
even in this podcast episode, it's very difficult to summarize every little nuance in there.
Oh, it's impossible. You have to read it for yourself twice.
Yeah.
3 times, probably 4 times.
Probably, yeah. I mean, it would be interesting for me to go and reread it again now that I know how it all ends. But
right. Well, the
like
first time I did
had
not notice the name drops of like Norma Simva. I didn't notice that at all the first read through. And the second time I was like, oh, that's interesting.
Yeah. There's definitely some very interesting things that only come into play in the last couple books. So,
heck yeah. So we recommend Dune, and we also recommend the MX2. Highly recommend the MX2.
indeed, indeed. Thanks for listening.
Be safe, have fun.